The alien cat princess whipped the human with her tail and dislocated it. Ozone and spilled coolant hung in the station bar, a metallic tang under the scent of fried protein and old smoke. The hum of gravity plates underfoot vibrated like a held breath. His quiet life is about to end violently. She thought she understood strength until bone announced otherwise. The bar sat like a bruised planet at the end of a freight concourse, a low dome of corrugated alloy, windows fogged with salt, and the breath of 1,000 short nights. The smell was metal and fried algae, a layer of oil that gathered in the grooves of the tables. Beneath that, if you listened, there was the wet whisper of old blood and ozone from the charger stacks behind the bar. The gravity field hummed as if someone below had pushed a hand against the world. It kept the glasses from drifting and the arguments in their proper places. Walls bore the sticky maps of favors traded and debts still owed, scrawled coordinates beneath a ring of condensation. A battered service droid blinked in blue and kept the music low, a looped saxophone that would not die. Jace kept his back to that wall. Habit, muscle memory, the old reflex of a man who had learned to read the room by how its shadows moved. He was broad with the dense, compressed build of someone born on a world where everything tried to squash you flat. His palms were thick as paving stones. The calluses smelled faintly of oil and old gunpowder. He kept his jacket closed against the draft, the cuff of a brace peeking like a dented promise under fabric. He played quiet, pushed his bowl of salted noodles across the table as if the motion could erase the past. Mira moved like a rumor. Her tale was a living argument of sable and silver, muscles rippling beneath fur that glinted like polished wire. She wore a band at the base of it, engraved with court sigils that said what she could not: royal, dangerous, measured. Her voice cut the room into pieces when she chose to use it, soft as catgut and cold as a glacial reef. She walked with purpose. When she sat, it was as if an audience had just taken a breath. There was an edge to her that kept people rearranged. They were not supposed to be in the same place. He kept to anonymity. She kept to duty. He had come for information, the kind that fit in an envelope and cost the life of a man who liked his back straight and his lies clean. She had come for a debt, a ledger of names she intended to burn. The bar's owner, a bulkhead of a woman with rivet scars, passed a thin envelope between them without comment. The paper smelled of formaldehyde and hot ink. The envelope contained a single map and a single sentence: your blood or your crown. The air leaned in. People adjusted in their seats, sensors twitching like insects. Outside, the freight line coughed. A train's bass made the lights pulse. Mira looked at Jace and then at the map. For the first time since the bar's saxophone loop had started, she smiled, and a blade folded under velvet like something alive. A courier's boots thudded the doorway. He was not the one holding the danger. He carried it. The courier handed a small cylinder to the owner, eyes flicking to Mira's tail as if it were a loaded thing. Mira's smile sharpened. Jace's hand tightened around his chopsticks until the wood creaked. The cylinder hissed, a thin scent of ozone slicing the air. They both knew that silver band at the base of Mira's tail meant more than lineage. It meant protocol, and protocol had teeth. The courier moved on. A guard at the door slipped a microtransponder under his collar with a thumb the color of tarnished brass. The room shifted. It was now a pressure chamber. Mira stood, up close. The fur along her spine brushed the air with the smell of warm musk and something sterile, like antiseptic. She leaned toward Jace inches and said, voice low as an undertow, "Do not quote protocol to me, Terran." He did not answer. Eyes met. There was history in that glance, nothing polite, everything unfinished. A muted gong from the bar announced the arrival of someone who kept violence like a coat. Mira's tail flicked once, a small movement that suggested control. The courier at the door coughed, a sound that threw the room into awareness. Mira's hand slid to that hidden blade. Jace's posture changed. He felt the old weight of being watched. The map on the table seemed suddenly too small for the stakes it held. She smiled again, a blade folded under velvet, and the bar held its breath. Subscribe to see what breaks first, the silence or the bones. Drop a comment. Which secret would you die to protect? The hum of the gravity plates tightened. The courier at the doorway had the dead look of someone who had held one too many secrets. Jace weighed the envelope like a man balancing a decision on his knuckles. Mira closed distance slow, controlled, tail lowering into an arc that made the air press the back of Jace's neck. The scent of her fur was animal and floral at once, detergent and feral oil. He felt something old in his throat, like the memory of a wound. Guards watched at their tables, hands hovering near blades. The gravity hum made the chandeliers chatter. One choice. He could walk away. Leave the map and the debt to a court that would grind them both to powder, or he could open the envelope and step into the teeth of obligations he had kept buried with his family. He chose the map. Mira's jaw tightened. She stepped closer until the tail's tip hovered like a metronome between them. The arc of that tail was the defining geometry of the night, a living whip, a regulated weapon that had felled diplomats and thieves alike. Her hand brushed the bass band like someone setting a chord. Then the courier coughed louder, and the room glided toward attention. He said one thing into the dim, "You cannot take that out." Jace's fingers closed. The map was thin paper. It revealed a tunnel below the northern spire, coordinates for a sealed vault. The courier's eyes were not on the paper. They were on Mira's tail. The tail twitched. In one breath, she made a motion that was both reprimand and demonstration. It started as an adjustment at the base, muscle tightening like a fist, and uncoiled. The arc described a quarter circle in the air, the tip a blur. Air displaced around it, a small shockwave that rattled the glasses. Jace reached instinctively, a reflex older than thought, to shield the map. The tail found his wrist. It struck with the contact of a whip and the intention of a hand. There was sound, a sharp, animal crack that split the saxophone loop. The tail rapped, then torque happened. The joint of his elbow caught a vector his body had not expected. There was a wet, intimate pop. A cartilage alignment surrendered with a little scream from the joint itself, not the throat. Pain flared like a white-hot ribbon along his forearm. Copper filled his mouth. He tasted metal, the acute tang of bone negotiating wrongness. Hollow bone sang differently under impact than dense bone. His cortical core wanted resistance, but was given a lever. Mira's tail had the tensile strength of braided composite and the finesse of a surgeon's hand. The base band bore the sigils of weight and duty. Torque transfer moved from tail to humerus in a sliver of a second. The noise the joint made was not a fracture, it was betrayal. His elbow dislocated outward, the humerus sliding from its well like a reluctant coin. For one heartbeat there was absolute silence. Conversation failed. Knives stopped their casual polishing. A cup clattered to the floor and shattered, the ceramic sound small and obscene. Mira's eyes widened in a way that made her older. Her mouth opened. This was not what she had intended. The look on her face was not triumph, but horror. The blade under velvet became irrelevant in that instant. Guards rose. A voice swore, sharp as a struck wire. He slumped, the map falling over his chest, sobering instantly into pain. The joint hung wrong, his fingers curled like a thing that did not belong to him. Mira reached at him with the wrong hand. Talons, pads, the cool, firm grip of a princess used to command, and her tail tightened reflexively out of shame. Her tail had been the instrument that marked him. There were witnesses. A barmaid whispered a cruel nickname under her breath. The syllables like gravel. Another patron's implant flashed. Cameras in the corner had already stenciled the impact in data. He tasted fear and hospital antiseptic. Mira stepped forward, the motion clumsy. and slipped beneath the shock of what she had done. For all her training, she had misread mass and bone geometry. The room's hum resumed like something that had been paused and restarted. The courier leaned back against the doorframe, eyes wide with that specific disbelief of someone who had seen a protocol fracture. Jace's face had gone pale around his mouth. Sweat salted his brow. He tried to breathe like a man unmoored from his body. Mira's tail wagged once, guilty as a child's, then thudded uselessly on the floor. She spoke, voice small and sharp like breaking glass. "Hold still." He could not move. The elbow's angle suggested the wrong direction. Nerves complained. Then a newer, stranger thing happened. He reached out with his good hand, grabbing Mira at the wrist with a tenderness that surprised them both. He pulled her close, not to strike, but to steady, to anchor. The attacker became the trembling thing needing steadiness. Guards hesitated. Someone called for a medic. Mira's cheeks burned. Her royal bearing had been cleaved by a human's pained hold. Witnesses leaned forward as if the room were a tribunal. The ambulance drones chirred softly outside, a layered mechanical buzz against the low mourning of the saxophone. He tasted copper, and the map under his chest smelled of dust and old secrets. Her tail, instrumental and royal, lay slack. In the space between pain and help, power had inverted. He had been struck, and he was also the hand that steadied her when the world tilted. They moved toward the door together, a beat-up Terran and a cat princess linked by a dislocated elbow and a new, ugly intimacy. The medic's boots thudded. The first diagnosis was technical and blunt. Closed reduction, severe dislocation, ligaments stressed beyond their tolerance, swelling imminent. The public humiliation had already started. Someone in the corner had recorded the sequence, and the clip would not die. They had cracked the fragile piece of the bar. They had, in a single motion, rewritten their roles. They were both aware, like colliding planets, that nothing would ever settle the same way again. Rumors moved faster than antiseptic through the station. By the time they left the medbay, the clip had 2,000 replays on a public feed and a dozen tinted comments calling her a brutish monarch and him a fool. The hum of the gravity plates outside sounded like a judge clearing a throat. Guards in the corridor watched them pass. One fingerless glove tapped the rim of a cup like a Morse code of curiosity. Mira walked with a stabilizer band newly fit around her tailbase, the metal cool against fur. The brace on Jace's elbow was a grid of polymer and smart fiber that clicked faintly with his pulse. It smelled of disinfectant and something sweet he associated with sterile rooms. They moved through whispers. Prince's pet, coward's hand, mercenary who could not take a tail. The thermometer of public opinion spiked and dipped like a bad engine. Worse than the mocking was the recalculation of power. He had been hit, and the assault had been recorded. People loved to see a topfall and a ground-up person judged. There were hearings scheduled before either of them had healed. In private, recovery was a different language. The medbay smelled of ozone and warmed gel packs. He lay on a narrow bed, while Mira sat in a chair by the window, tail coiled on a pillow. She watched the skyline, the glow of freight gates, the smear of advertisements like halos over distant metal. He practiced moving his arm the way a man practices not seeing a wound. The therapist, one of those clinical old women who could read scars like scripture, taught patience as if it were a technique. Mira's fingers learned the slow economy of helping, how to pass a glass without jostling, how to tuck a sleeve so a brace did not catch. Their hands learned small trades. He taught her how to breathe through pain, a habit honed in bunkers where air could be the difference between life and death. She taught him the names of muscle knots in her tongue, words that tasted like salt lip and old courtrooms. They discovered common ground like two survivors counting missing ribs. She had a history of being broken into perfect lines, rituals, beatings that had been both law and lesson. The encrusted scars along the base of her tail were maps of ceremonies where flesh had been surrendered to prove worth. He had lost a colony in a single night of fire. The smell of charred textile came up in the way he flinched when lights shimmered. They were both made by systems that prized obedience over survival. That understanding made them dangerous allies. It also made them tender with one another in small, precise ways. A week after the injury, she surprised him by showing up at the therapy table with a homemade sling. It was not pretty. Braided fiber, the smell of her fur still on one edge, but it was made with the calculus of someone who had held councils of war. She set it around his shoulders like armor and said, "Flat, tradition is just peer pressure from dead people." He laughed, a sound that was more like a breath, and it surprised her into smiling. But the world outside was sharpening its knives. A corporate envoy arrived in a suit of grey that swallowed light. Their badge carried the imprint of the Spire Corporation that had long wanted the vault beneath the northern spire for its own reasons. The envoy's eyes flicked to the band at the base of Mira's tail, then to the brace on Jace's arm. They offered help for a price. The Spire wanted the map and would pay in favors that smelled of iron. Then a more dangerous whisper wound its way through the feeds. The admiral who ruled the freight lanes had been seen at the northern spire the night the vault was sealed. If the admiral moved, crates full of bones and old weapons would shift, and those with power would decide who lived by the tolls they imposed. A hit was placed on the courier who had brought the cylinder. They found him in a stairwell with 3 holes in his back and a cheap synth flute in his hands. Witnesses said the flankers had moved through the crowd like smoke. Jace and Mira realized the incident was not an accident, but a calibration. The act that had humiliated them had also been the ignition. They were now markers on a target, 2 bodies shaped by different storms, but pointing at the same hurricane. Plans formed in the dark, where the medbay lights hummed low. She argued for court and protocol, for a formal complaint that would drag the Spire into legal light and embarrass its backers. He argued for going to the tunnels, for using the map now. The vault could hold leverage big enough to make the Admiral blink. Neither fully trusted the other's motives. Both recognized what the other had to lose. Their choices threaded together. He offered contact routes from old networks. She offered the seal codes in exchange for protection that smelled like allegiance. The alliance was brittle and sharp, built on necessity and the echo of the tale. They practiced sequences in half-light, how she would distract, how he would move like a counterweight. In quiet moments, they traded personal scars like contraband, tiny admissions that built something more than strategy. But rumor did its work. At a market stall, a child pointed at Mira and hissed because the clip had been looped and dubbed with music that turned her motion into a dance. The tribunal of public opinion had already chosen sides. The corporate envoy returned with a different face, a smile that promised favors in the currency of pain. They offered information on the Admiral's movements if Mira would denounce Jace. She almost did it, for a heartbeat, where the old ritual voice in her head said stability over choice. Then she saw him lift a tray of bowls with his good hand, steering it like a man who knew how to keep what he loved from shattering. That small scene, him balancing food with an injured arm, the nervous patience in his jaw, broke something loose. She could not sign a sentence that would kill his past and her future. They were now less enemy and more wound shared. Outside, a black drone mapped the route to the northern spire, and the first assassin's contract circulated like a fever. The consequence wave moved outward until it threatened an entire freight line of people who had nothing to do with them. They had to move, and they had to do it together. The trap fired like a clock. They walked into the ambush because they had to. No graceful choice, only the calculus of necessity. The spire's underlevels were a maze of iron ribs and warm gear lube smells. a place where gravity fields stuttered and sent your boots light as paper. Drones hummed like rats in the rafters. Mira could not fight cleanly. Her tail brace limited the whip's arc, and the base joint had a shudder that made precision impossible. She moved with a hunger that had been hollowed by injury, using eyes and teeth and the tail's shivering nerve to direct. Jace moved like a slow blade, methodical, heavy, able to take blows most men would not shrug off. His injured arm was a compass of pain. He learned to lean his body to compensate, to give weight where an elbow could not. They had to cross a catwalk, lined with cargo crates stacked like bones. The assailants were efficient, a quartet of magknife carriers with soft armor and a pair of orbital tasters that crackled like angry bees. The first strike came as a shimmer of blue light across the metal. Jace took it for her, an energy arc seeking the higher mass, and the capacitor grazed his shoulder, leaving a line of numb heat across his sternum. He staggered but kept moving, a living dam. Mira's tail flicked with new intent. She had learned something in the week since the injury. Pain had taught her how to channel the tail's momentum differently, to use its base as an anchor rather than a reach. When one attacker lunged at him with a magknife, she struck, not at the arm, but at the attacker's thigh, using the brace like a pivot. The tail rapped, then yanked, and the assailant went down with a scream that was part surprise and part admission. The tail, though damaged, had old-school leverage. A whip becomes a restraining cord when used close. Jace slid beneath a crate and bolted a support cable with his good hand. He hauled until the crate fell, a weight that smashed the drone between them and gave them breathing room. Then the second defining reversal happened. An orbital taster locked onto him. Mira used her injured tail to intercept a bolt meant for his chest. The bolt struck the tail's brace with a sizzle. The band smoked, and a little arc licked his trousers. He took the shock through his torso anyway, because he had shifted weight to save her when he had not been able to save himself earlier. Roll reversal again. His ribs took impact, and he tasted salt and iron. Somewhere above, someone laughed into a comm, and the sound dropped like a stone. They escaped the catwalk into a maintenance shaft smelling of coolant and hot metal, the air clinging to their clothes. The shaft was narrow. They breathed close. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, tail coiled like a vow, and said low, "Better my ribs than your tail." He replied, breath ragged, "I might be heavy, but you shatter if you bump a table." They worked through the panic with mechanics. He showed her how to lock a wrist so that a joint would not be levered out again. She taught him a movement that let his injured arm act as balance instead of a liability. They moved like two halves of a machine. She observed, he executed. At a collapsed junction, they found a med crate and patched flesh with fast gauze, the smell of antiseptic biting the air. He touched the base of her tail and felt the indent of scar tissue beneath the band. She went quiet, the line of her mouth flattened. In that silence, a truth was offered without fanfare. He had been sent here by a handler who wanted the map and would have left him to rot if the price was right. She had been conditioned by a culture that took pieces of her to make her useful. The confession gave them both blood. It also gave them leverage. They would use that honesty as a weapon. They began to plan a counterstrike. Escape required them to cross the freight concourse again, where traders slept in the cargo hold, and cameras blinked like eyes. Jace moved with a calculated limp, using his bulk to shield Mira where her tail would show. She directed crowds with a small, authoritative toss of her voice, a trick from court where a single syllable bent crowds to order. They broke into the open under a sky that smelled of ion rain and diesel. Cameras adjusted to find faces. A bounty sensor already pinged across the line. A flyer screamed overhead with the spire's crest, making the open feel crowded and watched. At the far end of the concourse, a convoy waited, the Admiral's insignia black on a grey field. The man who had orchestrated the ambush was visible, a thin animal in a suit, eyes like polished chrome. He clapped once as they emerged and said, polite as a surgeon, "You two should not have joined forces. It complicates things." Mira's tail twitched. Jace felt the old cold run through him. They had chosen each other over self-preservation before the moment the man applauded. Now applause was a warning to finish the job. They had their one truth. They were better together than apart. The man smiled like a hinge that had been oiled by cruelty. Above, the freight line speakers began to broadcast the clip again with a new overlay of music that made them look foolish. The crowd sucked air. They had one option left. This time, it would require them to risk everything they had left. The tribunal was a glass amphitheater suspended over the concourse, lights like predators. It smelled of disinfectant and the expensive cologne that men wore to hide the way they feared being small. The Spire had called its hearings, a public display with seats sold to the highest bidders. They had arranged the plays, evidence screens, witness pods, and an audience hungry for punishment. Mira stood at the dock with her tailband exposed, the brace new and humming. Jace sat beside her on a bench, his profile heavy and compact, the brace on his elbow a darker mark that invited comment. The Admiral presided like a storm, his bald head a map of carved decisions. The corporation sent a representative with a smile that smelled like iron credits. Cameras recorded the moment as if it were a ritual. The charges were framed as dishonor, as a failure of decorum. The envoy stepped forward and placed the courier's cylinder on the stand. The public wanted spectacle. They were given a system of stakes. If she denounced him, the envoy would deliver the Admiral's cooperation and clear a path to the vault without bloodshed. If he disavowed his old network, the Admiral would pronounce them pardoned and the map would be null. Either path saved many, lives of the working freight and passengers, but required betrayal of one another. The impossible choice tightened like a vice. Jace could think one word, and the Spire would shatter. He could send a signal that would collapse the convoy's route and save thousands, but at the cost of handing Mira's lineage to the gallows. Or he could sabotage the signal, keep the network alive, and doom many to the cartel's tolls. The tribunal's lights roasted their faces. Mira looked down at her hands, fingers steady. The crowd leaned in as if they could coax a sincere answer by pressure alone. The Admiral spoke, his voice a rasp of policy. He offered the law as an axe. The clip from the bar was played on the great screen again and again, frame by frame. The motion of that whip looped into token amusement. A child in the audience had imprinted the loop into a shirt and wore it like a medal. He kept watching Jace as if Jace were a fuse. The confession bomb came not as a howl, but as a statement. Jace rose, slow and deliberate, weight balancing on the good leg. He looked at the cameras and then at Mira. He told the amphitheater the truth about his handler, that he had been sent to steal the map, that he had planned to sell it to the highest bidder in the event of betrayal. He placed his hand over his injured arm and let the room see the brace. Then he said, flat as iron, "I am not a martyr. I am a fool who thought silence would save the people I could not protect." The room gasped. Someone yelled that he was trying to ruin them all. Mira's fingers fluttered. She stood. Her voice, when it came, was like a blade drawn. She said, with royal cadence and an edge of humor that tasted like salt, "Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people." The words landed like grenades. Public opinion buckled. The Admiral's face tightened. The envoy's smile calcified. Then Mira did something the tribunal had not purchased. She stepped away from the platform, walked to Jace, and took his free hand. The cameras zoomed in on the contact like vultures. She said quietly, "Better my ribs than your tail," and the auditorium inhaled as one. That admission rewired the calculus of everyone present. Her band, once symbol of authority, now looked like a promise. She placed her tail around his wrist as if fastening a token, the leather of the brace warm against polymer. In that moment, courts shifted. Where there had been a line, they crossed it. They chose each other over the theater of safety the Admiral offered. The envoy hissed into his comm. Men with grey suits rose like a wave and moved toward them with sanctioned force. The Admiral's hand rested on a holster that had never failed. The choice had consequences immediate and pure. The convocation security watched with stilled faces. Outside, the convoy brakes released and a siren began, not for celebration, but for containment. Jace and Mira stood, hands linked, as men lunged with orders to take them. She used her tail to sweep a leg under one suited man, the movement precise and graceful, and he toppled into a tangle of expensive fabric. Jace slammed his shoulder into another, heavy as a falling door. The amphitheater dissolved into a fight that smelled of sweat and ozone and the rank spice of fear. They had chosen each other. Now they had to choose the people they were trying to save. The tribunal's protocol offered them an ultimatum: betray or burn. They chose the burn. The act of faith required that one of them unclip the transmitter that would collapse the convoy track. Mira's duty to Crown said she must refuse. Jace's handler demanded he comply. They both reached for the same device and then did something no one had expected. They disarmed the system together, fingers meeting, palms pressed, and for a single second their vulnerability was a weapon. That touch made the crowd falter. A shot rang out in the main concourse. A man in the balcony had gone for a rifle. He fell without dramatic noise, the fall more tragic because it was small and quick. The hearing became a war. In the smoke and glass, they moved like two halves of a single machine, every choice a promise. They had become partners not by law, but by sacrifice. The audience loved the spectacle and hated the betrayal. The Admiral's plan unspooled as security cracked. The convoy was rerouted by a circuit they could not control. The Empire's men had miscalculated. Two broken people make unpredictable decisions. The public reaction was a bruise that would not fade. They had seen an attack, a confession, and a deliberate refusal to save the comfortable at cost of one another. Cameras recorded everything. Someone would cut that footage into a piece that would be played in dormitories for years. In the end, when the smoke settled and bodies were being counted, they had saved lives and lost innocence. They had chosen each other in the face of an old machine that demanded otherwise. The cost would be paid later, in exile and price and bounty, but in that moment there was a simple, terrible beauty in the decision. They walked away with hands clasped and scars still warm. The dust that followed wore the color of rust. Weeks later, the station smelled different. Salted wind from open cargo bays, the faint perfume of jasmine from a visitor's coat, the persistent tang of antiseptic on bandages. They had fled the tribunal, but not escaped consequence. A bounty transponder hummed under Jace's jacket like a toothache. Mira's band had a fracture line that showed in close light, a hairline crack that made it glint like a fault. Time passed like a slow current. They slept in shifts on a rusted freighter that smelled of fried protein and old worries. The ship's engine thrummed a lullaby. Their partnership formalized less by ceremony than by necessity. In the market, they spoke each other's names to save the other from ambush. In back alleys, they traded favors with an economy of glances. Neither side had won. The corporation rewired contracts. A few small executives lost positions. The Admiral retreated with a palette of threats he could not yet afford to spend. Socially, they were a scandal and an inspiration. A mural in a cargo tunnel depicted a silhouette of a cattail wrapped around a human wrist, paint flaking where hands had touched it too often. In private, the healing took its odd and precious shapes. Mira's tail healed with a kink that would never go away. It carried the scar tissue like a memory. Jace's elbow learned new quirks, stiffness in cold weather, a twitch after long runs. He wore a bracelet where the tail had first closed around his wrist, a cuff of braided fiber and metal. Sometimes they sat by the freighter hatch and watched the nebula smear across the sky like spilled ink. She would curl her tail around his wrist, not as a weapon, but as a tether. The touch was small and reverent. The fur was warm against skin, an intimacy learned in blood and repair. He would trace the healed line along the base of the tail with a thumb that had once been a blunt instrument. "Next time," he said softly, voice rough from sleep, "let's start with a handshake." She smiled. Slow, an old world and a new one colliding. He tasted the salt of her laughter and remembered the pop of the joint, the way the room had gone silent. They told each other pieces of their pasts that had been smothered under orders. She spoke about rituals that had once made her a trophy, about being paraded and measured like a commodity. He told her about a night when the colony fire had come and how he had carried his sister out by her hair and left a trail of soot on his uniform. They did not cure each other. They traded scars and learned to carry them. The station's politics churned. The convoy's leadership shifted to newer hands, who were slyer. News feeds argued over whether they were traitors or saints. Merchants sold cheap trinkets of their likenesses. Children wore the T-shirts and pointed when they saw Mira in a market. But there was an unresolved thread that ran like a live wire through their quiet days. A fleet signal, a whisper in the static that spoke of a spire's reinforcement moving along the outer ring. It meant the Admiral was not done. It meant history had not finished its teeth with them. They prepared, because that is what survivors do: plan, store, train. They honed the tail's movement so that it could do two things at once: caress and weaponize. Jace learned to duck in ways that saved both their throats. They made a map of allies and enemies, with ink rubbed off in places where hands had trembled. Then there were small moments, private and luminous. In a hangar that smelled of oil and sun-warmed metal, she wound her tail gently around his wrist where the bracelet lay and tightened it like a promise. He placed his hand over hers, the touch soft and reverent. He whispered, "History is heavy, then let me help carry it." She replied without flourish, "I might be heavy, but you shatter if you bump a table." The reply made him laugh and cry at the same time. They were not free. Bounties still tracked them, and political enemies sharpened teeth. But the final image was simple. Two silhouettes under a nebula, an odd union of a soldier and a broken princess. Her tail looped once around his wrist. His good hand rested on the small of her back. Stars hummed above. The freighter's engine thrummed underfoot. In a world that prizes tactic over tenderness, they had forged a bond in the place where bone gives way and hands decide to hold. The wound at the elbow remained a map beneath his sleeve. The scar at the tail's base glinted like a coin. They would carry those marks into whatever came next. The station might burn again, regimes might change as breeds of predatory men took the corridors. But for tonight, they stood together, bound by broken bone and a choice that would not be undone. The heavy soldier and the glass princess, linked by a tail that could wound and a wrist that learned to trust it, watched the horizon and prepared for the next storm.